Welcome to the Takeaways podcast. On today's episode, I'm with Tony Anscombe, and he's the Chief Security Evangelist at ESET. On today's episode, we're going to talk about an issue which don't really get a lot of coverage, but is extremely, important in technology, and that's the cybersecurity. So we're going to be having a breakdown of the H2 2025 threat report that ESET released this week, and then we dive into key takeaways, and then how do they relate to the digital economy in South Africa. Hi, Tony. Good morning, and welcome to the Takeaways podcast. How are you, man?
I'm good, thank you, and it's good to join you, friend.
To start with, right, you are a cybersecurity professional. You've been in the field for decades. What do you think is the state of the cybersecurity globally at the moment before we trickle down to South Africa and to Africa?
Well, the issue you've got is that if you look, over my career, as you said, over decades, which certainly makes me start to feel old, by the way, when people say that. But if we look at the start of my career, when somebody was creating malware or creating things that would be they would be disruptive. Somewhere in the middle of that career, cyber criminals worked out that you could make money, and cryptocurrency came along and gave them the process to make money. So the anonymized payments, the international transactions that were outside of the financial regulation. So unfortunately, once you bring money into something, then you bring momentum, you bring motivation. And if you look at, for example, Chainalysis numbers over the last couple of years for ransomware payments, they're it's roughly $1 billion a year seems to flow into just ransomware groups. So whereas the state of the market, well, unfortunately, while you've got this huge amount of monetization, you're going to have this huge motivation for a bunch of cyber criminals to make money from it. There is then the other side as well. Of course, you've got nation states like to spy and have espionage and all those sorts of good things and attack each other. But that's kind of more expected. It's a bit more sophisticated. Typically, it's more about espionage than disruption, electronic spying, as opposed to the physical spying of maybe 30 or 40 years ago. But like I say, that's a separate conversation.
I want us to trickle down to South Africa, or to Africa in general, right? How do you think the landscape has evolved? Because I imagine in the old years, this was more of like a first world problem. But now that the whole world is connected, right, how has it impacted on the African continent and in South Africa specifically?
Well, I think you have to view it. Let's go back to that comment about monetization. That's where we start. And we see that in one of the statistics that is in that telemetry data. So if you and I were to go and start a business tomorrow, and that business was selling cups of coffee, we would open our coffee shop where people want to drink coffee. And when we want to open our second coffee shop, we make sure we open the second one where people want to drink coffee. We probably wouldn't start a coffee shop on the beach where people want to drink lemonade because it's more refreshing. So my point here is, it's about targeting. So if you said it's more of a first world problem. Well, yeah, I understand that, but it's also about cyber criminals sitting there going, okay, well, if I conduct this campaign, where am I likely to get the most customers? Or the most victims, I should rephrase that, shouldn't I? The most victims that I'm going to extract and extort money from. But from a cyber criminal's perspective, they are his customers. They are the paying people that fund his business. So therefore, and I say he, that's a generic term, they, because not just men that are cyber criminals. But if you look at that, then you'd expect it to go to very affluent countries first. But then as you get more cyber criminals and you get more opportunity and there's more data flowing in other countries, then you'll see that uptick in other places. So for example, if I look at phishing, you and I both get phishing emails on text or in our inbox or however they arrive. We both see them on a frequent basis. And they've got better, haven't they? They've got much, much better since the AI tools have made the content better, made them look nicer, harder to detect, etc. But if I look at just the number of phishing detections in our telemetry, in Africa as a continent, we see around about a third. So about 32, 33% of all of our detections are related in some way to phishing. Now, whether that's a website or whether that's an attachment in email or whether it's, whatever it might be, those are the detections. So that's kind of grouping everything together. If I look at the same data for South Africa specifically, it increases by around 10%. Yeah. Now, if I look at North America, where somebody's personal data may be seen to be more valuable, or companies have a higher propensity to pay a ransomware demand, it goes over to 52%. So that shows the targeting that is happening in cybercrime. So phishing emails are focused on where they're going to actually convert the victim to be paying them something, or they can steal the data that has most value.
I guess then it's a double-edged sword in that the more a market gets more digitalization, the more then the bad actors see it as an attractive place to be able to do these, all these threats, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at things like the healthcare industry. 15, 20 years ago, it was all paper records. But as it digitized, that data becomes valuable. If I can steal your health records, then I can steal your health insurance. I can extort you because I know about your health details, etc. There's probably payment methods in health records, etc., etc. So there's lots of rich data. But if you look at how that digitization happens in the world, you tend to find that maybe Europe and the US go first, and then you'll see that proliferation of digitization in other countries, and then the wider world will start digitizing that. It takes time, so it's kind of who's first, and then how that plays out. So I think cybercrime is following much the same pattern.
Let's dive more into the data. This week, ESET released its H2 threat report. Can you just share, top findings that you had from that report and what it means for the state of cybersecurity?
Well, there were a few good examples in there. One of the highlights of the report, so in that second half of last year that the report covers, one of the things our researchers found was a piece of malware that uses AI. Now, you'll often hear cybersecurity people, and I hear this way too frequently, by the way, they say AI is attacking us. No, AI is not attacking you. Yeah, there's not some computer, we're not in a Terminator film or whatever it might be. AI has not quite got to that stage yet. But AI is being used by cyber criminals as tools. We mentioned phishing just a moment ago, or they might build malware using some AI tools to build some of the scripts, etc. What we found, though, what we discovered, was a piece of malware in the public domain, and that malware was dynamically creating scripts on the fly. So it was actually using a public LLM, so a public AI tool, to generate scripts based on the environment that it was seeing on the user's machine and wider network. So it was saying, if you see data like this, would you exfiltrate? Would you encrypt? What would you do next? And it was actually using this dynamically. Now, this is really hard to detect because you can imagine that, an AI bot is creating this code on demand. So there's no malware, so to speak, that's been seen before. It's being created on demand. Now, this truly is AI being used in a different way. Now, the fortunate part about this story is that actually it was a proof of concept because it wasn't seen in the wild. It was seen in a repository somewhere where we picked it up from. And while it was unique in the way it worked, an academic who was doing a project for, I think it was NYU in the US, had tested this in a public in a public repository. So they tested it on VirusTotal to see whether anybody detected it. But the problem is, once you put that sample there, somebody else will come along, pick up the sample. The bad actor will modify it, use it. What you're doing is you're giving them the code. You're giving them the kickstart to do things in a different way. So I'd expect to see more of this. Now, the reason I point this one out is because then AI would be AI would, to a degree, start to be responsible for attacking you in some way. However, the original targeting would still be that of a cyber criminal. So it's still a kind of hybrid state.
while still on the topic of AI, I think one interesting thing that has really, appalled me over the last few months is agentic AI, right? And I think now it's moving from a retail use to more enterprise use. What do you think are the impacts of a business giving AI agent all the access to all the files in the company? What cybersecurity risks do you think are there, and how should companies try to think about that?
Well, that's a very good question. And that's probably a podcast in its own, but let's try and summarize that. Now, so what do we mean? And I'm going to come back to one specific thing you said here. So imagine somebody in the company turns around and says, and unfortunately, there's a fashion and drive and motivation to do this quickly. So if you're a company that's got investors, you want to be seen to be using AI in the business, your investors will be happy that you're going in this way. It will be impress your employees that you're going in this. There's lots of motivation. Now, firstly, you don't want to do this too quickly. You want to do this with considerable consideration, because if you just put all these agents out there, and the thing you said, which I'm going to pick up on, is and give it all access, everything in the company. Well, there you've made a fatal mistake, because the AI agent then has access to your customer personal information, possibly. Even if you're only focusing it on a customer support system, a customer may have given a phone number or an email address in a response to an agent. So therefore, suddenly that data is in the public domain. So now you don't want to have an AI agent looking at that data, going, well, this is all support data, I can reuse this. And suddenly somebody asks the right question of a support chatbot that actually surfaces another customer's information or surfaces something in other ways. And we've seen there's been reasonable examples of that already. I think there was didn't somebody trick a car company into selling a car for like $1 or something, wasn't it? Because the agent didn't have the right boundaries. Now, if you take AI and treat it like you would a human, this is the best way that I think to view this. If you had somebody joining your company tomorrow and they are a customer service agent, you would give them access to the pieces of data in your organization that they need. You wouldn't give them access to everything in your company and say, here you go, yeah, this will help you in your job. You'd only give them access to what they need. The people in the finance team would only have access to the finance records they need, etc. So you would limit it. You need to limit AI agents in the same way. They only need to have access to the data actually that's relevant to what they're doing for you. So I'd say kind of treat them like a human in that way, to make sure that you limit leakage of data, possible leakage of data, or for somebody to come along and, unfortunately make the AI do something that was unintended.
We are currently at a point where we are in the hype of AI, etc. And I'm imagining a lot of companies are under pressure from boards, etc., to try to implement these new technologies, which are unproven in most instances, right? How do you strike a balance between adopting these new technologies, but also ensuring that they don't lead to, a disaster in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, you've got to make sure not only that the AI agents have access to only the data they need. You've got to also make sure that you're securing the systems. So, if you can imagine, let me give you a futuristic-looking example. Okay, in our coffee shop, that coffee shop you and I have started. Just say we create AI agents and we don't secure them correctly. And now a rival coffee shop down the street decides that actually he wants to mess with our AI agents, the people where people can ask questions about our coffee. And slowly they poison our data. So they find access into our network somehow. And because we haven't secured our data correctly, and we haven't secured the access from the AI agents into that data, i.e., let's just say we're using some sort of open way that the AI agent can talk to the data. That other coffee shop, if they're clever enough and work that out, then they can start seeding that data. They could start manipulating the data that the agent is working from. And in 6 months' time, when our own chatbot is giving our customers advice that our coffee is no longer good to drink and you shouldn't get coffee there, they might ring up and turn and say, well, we've poisoned your data. for $2 million, we'll tell you what we did. Because if they poisoned it over time, it would be really difficult to track. So my point here is you need to lock down that data. It's not just about giving the AI agent only the access it needs. It's making sure that it's only accessing it in a secure fashion. Now, the reason I point this out is there have been examples in the market where there was a company recently who had a piece of software and they had an API, and all of their customers, all of the partners that were using the API to access their software were using the same password because the API only had one password in it. So there's a great example of, that's a bad implementation of AI. You shouldn't have lost the idea that actually each customer should have had their own authentication. It should have been unique. There should have been requirements that the authentication was strong, etc. So my point here is the same security that you'd apply elsewhere still applies. Just because it's AI doesn't mean it's secure. It probably means actually you need to give it more consideration and more security in that way.
From your point of view, right, do you think AI brings a net good or a net bad to cybersecurity?
At the moment, we've only talked about AI maybe from one perspective. In the last 10 years, you've seen companies appear on the market going, we have the silver bullet in cybersecurity, we have AI. Our cybersecurity products use AI. So AI is also a tool for defenders. That's my point here is, AI is, but it's actually been used much longer than that. So here at ESET, we've been using AI for over 25 years. So actually in the late 1990s, we looked at using neural networks in the detection of macro viruses. Imagine in the early 2000s that we'd turn and said, hey, our cybersecurity solution is using AI. Everybody would have been scared and run for the hills because there wasn't enough understood about what technology could do in that way. My point is AI is not new. AI is just more available to you and I. It was already being used, for example, in companies like ESET in the background. And it had to be used by companies like us at that time, because if you look at the volumes and quantity of cyber attacks and malware samples, et cetera, actually to deal with the levels of volume, you would need automation and you need intelligent automation to make decisions. So actually AI was a tool that's been used for many years certainly by ESET in that way. So AI is not all bad. And you often hear people refer to some technologies as being, is it good or bad? No technology is bad. It's the way somebody uses a technology that can be bad.
In cybersecurity, there is this, it's not really a principle, but it's something that I've heard a lot of the experts talk about, that you can create a system that's really strong and it's a fortress, but it takes one person clicking a file on an email to destroy it all, right? How do you think social engineering has evolved in cybersecurity, and how do you see it evolving, especially now in the midst of prompts and AI and everything?
Well, if we could just stop humans from using technology, we'd be there, wouldn't we? No, and I kind of say that with a big smile on my face. Of course, we can't stop humans using technology, but how's it evolved? Well, it has become far more sophisticated. However, I also think that there is a lot of what I define as low-hanging fruit out there. There's a lot of companies still that don't put multi-factor authentication on. In fact, I spoke to somebody yesterday who said they've switched it off because their users don't like it. It's like, look, this is cybersecurity 101. Switch it back on. So social engineering has got audacious and more sophisticated, but I'm surprised it hasn't got more sophisticated. And the reason, so let me give you an example of why I'm surprised is you and I have both had our data breached, and not only have we had it breached, we've had it breached numerous times. And if we go out on the dark web, you'll be able to find this breach and that breach, and maybe 5 different breaches that your data and my data are in. Cyber criminals haven't taken the effort to go and join the dots, because if they now sent you an email that joined the dots and looked at all 5 data breaches that know more about you and join like an ID profiler and attack you from a point of intelligence, it would become even more sophisticated and more believable. So my point here is, there's low-hanging fruit. They get one breach, they write an email based on a campaign, and they try and phish you on that one campaign or socially engineer you on that one campaign. Yeah. And that's because there are so many people that will hand over the credentials to an account, hand over whatever it is that the phishing campaign is looking for. So there needs to be greater sophistication from the victim. We need to understand that actually if somebody's asking us something out of context, we just don't give it. I look at some emails that I get internally that will say, we've got to, you need to change something. I just delete them. And then a week later, I see the same email coming from the IT team saying, could you please do this? We asked you last week. It's like, no, I didn't believe it was you, so I just deleted it. So everybody needs to start taking what I define as a zero trust attitude. Trust nothing that turns up in your inbox. And if you have that attitude, and then verify the things that you think might be real. If we can get people thinking like this, then I think phishing starts to degrade. However, unfortunately, human behavior also says that we're suckers for being told something's urgent. And the Winter Olympics are around the corner here, aren't they? Or they're on at the moment. So if somebody sends me a great video of, did you see this person skiing backwards and doing a flip? Would I click on it? Maybe. And suddenly there you go. I've been suckered into a phishing scam or malware being downloaded. So I'm just saying, unfortunately, there is human behavior. The best anti-phishing thing I've seen is a bank actually in the Netherlands. If you're the first person in a company to send the unique phishing example to the phishing inbox of the security team, they send you chocolate. I love this idea. Yeah. I would get to my inbox every morning and send them all the phishing emails that are in my inbox. But that's the point. It's making me think about it. And that's why it's such a great protection or changing the way we behave.
Another thing, according to your report, that has grown a lot is ransomware, both in the number of events and just the amount of the money that's lost and everything, right? The advent of crypto ever since 2010s has really accelerated ransomware, right? From your POV as obviously, like a professional, how do you see it at the moment and how should companies try to think of it?
Well, I think this is a very complex conversation. And the reason being is I could take a cybersecurity view here in turn and say, well, you should never pay a ransomware demand. And I'd like to think a lot of people would agree with that. However, right now, if I'll take an example that's a couple of years old. MGM and Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, their hotel groups both got hit by ransomware within a 2-week time frame of each other. One paid and one didn't. The one that paid, it cost them about $15 million, and the one that didn't pay, it cost them about $120 million to rebuild their systems, the business disruption, et cetera, right now. So now, if somebody gets attacked, is it the decision of the cybersecurity people who are sitting there thumping the table going, we're not paying, and the CFO walks in and turns around and says, it's fine. It's $5 million, let's pay, because it will cost us more than $5 million if we don't. So unfortunately, this becomes a financial decision. And then companies may well have business disruption or cyber insurance. So they may then have insured against cyber risk in the same way you insure your business for other risks. Cyber insurance is a growing industry. And if you look at claims data that's published in the US, around 40% of claimants in the US pay the ransomware demand. So how do you stop you said this rise of cryptocurrency? It's a rise of cryptocurrency, but it's also, unfortunately, cheaper, a lot of the time cheaper to pay than it is to be morally and ethically correct to not pay. I don't know, I do know how you stop this. What you do is you regulate cryptocurrency. But unfortunately, that's not something that I think is going to happen. And I think that, that's a long gone scenario. But that's what should happen. You've got to take the monetization out of it. If you think about this, in a ransomware attack, you have multiple parties. You have a credential broker, an affiliate, and then you have a ransomware gang. We tend to only hear about the last piece, the ransomware gangs. It's so-and-so's ransomware. Yeah, great. But the problem is, so if I put 50,000 affiliates in the world and I've got 10 ransomware gangs, if you take one of these ransomware gangs down, there's still 9 left, and the affiliates will just go and work with those 9. So if you are working with the one that gets taken down, you're not going to stop your attacks or your campaigns. You'll just switch provider. And that's unfortunately the way to look at it. It needs to be looked at. So to do this, and to cut out all those affiliates and all those credential brokers, to cut out the entire stream, the entire length of this business model, I think you have to turn the money off somehow.
You're obviously more of the expert here, but I think one of the things that's really leads to the growth of these attacks is the fact that a lot of them are not reported. I mean, if a bank has ransomware attack, they are not going to put out a press release and say, we paid this entity this much to be able to get our data back, right? How do you think this under-reporting leads to even more cases? And what do you think should be the next way forward?
Well, actually, I agree with something that's happened in the US. So the Securities Exchange Commission at the SEC have some rulings in there that make, so if you're a public company and you have a significant cyber incident, and there's some guidance on what they mean by significant or a material cyber incident, you have to actually report it to the exchange. And the reason you have to report it is because your investors should know that you have an issue. Because if you're about to buy some shares in that company, you might make the decision not to buy them based on the fact that, tomorrow they're going to announce a data, we know they've had a data breach. So I actually believe reporting is a good thing. However, reporting needs to do more than just reporting. What you don't want to do is get in the way of somebody actually doing their incident response correctly. So, reporting needs to then be joined up, and law enforcement needs to have the right resources, et cetera, for the quantity of crime and all these sorts of things. So I think companies should have mandatory reporting. People should know if there's a cyber attack, somebody's paid a ransomware demand or data's been breached, it should be in the public domain.
Still on the topic of the ransomware attacks, right? What's the mistakes that you see a lot of companies do? You already stated that you, as a professional, would not recommend paying a ransom. But apart from that, what's the mistake that you see a lot of companies do that leads to them being like a victim of these kind of attacks?
Well, there's certain things. I mean, I mentioned MFA earlier on. I mean, to me, it's just a simple win. If you and I go onto certain public databases and look for companies that have, for example, RDP or VPN servers that are public facing, we'll find some. And what we'll find is some of those have an ID and password, and they don't have MFA securing them. And this I think relates to an attitude of, well, our users don't like it, or, I'm not going to be the target of a cyber criminal. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, you will be a target of a cyber criminal because you're low-hanging fruit, and unfortunately, they will come and try and brute force their way in. And RDP has changed in the last number of years. And in fact, in that H2 threat report data, specifically for Africa, if you look, the number of RDP attacks climbed slightly in the end of H2. But companies need to turn on what I define as the easy wins, of turning on things like MFA. I mean, the day of the password, in my view, I mean, we still read articles that people are using these passwords and whatever. If you're still using just passwords, you're already at risk. The other big one I think is really important is understanding what it is you're trying to protect, understanding all the assets that you have in your business, and making sure, for example, you have vulnerability and patch management systems. That's the other weakness a lot of companies have, is they don't patch quickly enough, or they don't understand all the things that need patching. And that's certainly true, I think, of smaller businesses. You need to understand everything that's connected needs to have a level of software on it that gives the best protection.
Whilst on the conversation of small businesses, right? It's 2026, but most companies, regardless of either it's a JSE company or a small business, still view cybersecurity as more of a nice to have than a should have. How do you strike that balance between ensuring that there is a budget for cybersecurity, but then again, the small business and they're struggling, they have to pay bills?
Cybersecurity should be like everything else, every other risk that you address in your business. So, I mean, if you want to protect yourself against fire, you might have a sprinkler system, and you might have fire extinguishers. Some employees might be fire wardens, and you do frequent evacuation tests, to comply with probably regulations. Cybersecurity is no different. It's a risk to your business. And that's realistically the way it needs to be thought about, because it can stop your business, it can financially damage your business, it could potentially even close your business down. So there is a business risk here, and that risk should be addressed with the right budget and the right resources. Now, there might not be the regulations that say you need the fire extinguishers or the sprinkler system that there are in other risk scenarios, but you should follow the best practice to make sure that actually you're protecting in the right way. And I think that's the importance. It's no longer an issue for the IT team or the cybersecurity team. This is a discussion that actually should be had at a board level or at the very top of a company, because every company will have a different line in the sand of where acceptable risk is. So you've got to define in your company where you're willing to accept risk and where you're not willing to accept risk, and then deploy cybersecurity technologies around that. Now, if I was in a small business, the other challenge there is finding the right people to help you, because we all know there's a shortage of quality cybersecurity people in the world. I think the last number I saw said there were something like 3 million open positions, with only about a million potential candidates. So you're still short of 2 million people in the world doing cybersecurity. So that's challenging for a small business. You're going to have to pay a lot of money, and then you've got to find the right person. And this is actually where I would decide to outsource. Yeah, I would outsource to and put it in a managed environment, and I actually have somebody that purely understands cybersecurity risk, understands threat hunting, and is monitoring my systems 24/7, because it is a 24/7 issue. So I would go down the path of using MDR and having a managed provider look after my security in that way. And realistically, going forward, I think that's where a lot of companies will end up.
Whilst we're still on that topic of talent, why do you think there's such a wide gap between talent that's available in cybersecurity and the need for it?
Firstly, I'm not sure cybersecurity is the most sexy career. Yeah, if I went and talked to a bunch of kids in a school, you know, it would be the geeky one on the end of the classroom that would turn and say, "Yeah, I'm really interested in computers and cybersecurity." Yeah. So I don't think I think that is starting to be addressed. Firstly, a lot of the automation. So people turn and say there's a lot of automation in cybersecurity. There is, and that's because there is a talent shortage. So you try and automate some of those tasks. So I think that's being addressed partly by technology, requiring lower resource, but you still need quality people to actually do the monitoring, the threat hunting, etc. You need good security analysts sitting behind screens, actually looking to see what's going on. If you look at a lot of governments, they are putting a lot of effort into opening more university places in cybersecurity. I think there's the other thing that I think is important, though, is this is the type of career where sometimes it's not always just about experience. I talk to a lot of people that have gone off, done a cybersecurity course at the university, and they can't get a job because when they go to get a job, somebody says, well, you haven't got any experience. I think employers need to start opening their eyes slightly and saying, if we can't find the right people, you need to start bringing some of those graduates into play and giving them opportunity. If they've done 3 to 4 years at university learning the fundamentals, then we need to get them into the workplace and get so that we do start to answer that shortage issue.
I want to track back a bit. You mentioned that a lot of these issues, like in cybersecurity, regulation can go a long way impeding. The example that you gave is trying to regulate cryptocurrencies, right? But if you look at the regulatory environment, say in South Africa at the moment, there's the POPIA Act, the Cybersecurity Act, etc., etc. So there are these kind of laws. What do you think is the disconnect between these laws and the state of the attacks on the ground? Because the attacks are still happening, but the regulations are still there. So where do you think is the disconnect there?
Well, the regulations are there for multiple purposes. And regulations typically go down the path of reasonable security. You need to have reasonable security. And the reason they don't get into the granularities of what you need to deploy is because you'd forever be revising a regulation if you got into that granular approach. The disconnect comes when if there's not enough enforcement, examples in the marketplace. It's like anything, isn't it? You put a regulation in, and unfortunately, you need to then take somebody to task over, very publicly, that you're going to enforce this regulation. It's no good having a regulation that's not enforced. Now, I'm not sure in South Africa how powerful the regulator is, but it's important that regulators have teeth, so to speak, and can actually go and hold companies accountable for not having the right security in place, and have the resources themselves to actually go and investigate when a company hasn't got the right resources in place or didn't take the right actions. And I think that's a common issue. It takes time and effort, and it takes a lot of resource to go and hold companies accountable. I think companies do understand they need to have security. I think you've said it already. It's about a lack of budget. It's about, I've said it's about a lack of resource. And I think it's a lack of understanding. The board certainly still see cybersecurity as the dark, some sort of dark art, that those people in that room in the darkness, in the basement, it is a business risk, and it needs to be discussed as a business risk, and it needs to be a prioritized business risk. I do think COVID, the pandemic, helped, because when companies all had to go home and work, the people that enabled business were those cybersecurity people that were in the basement. So I think to a level that the cybersecurity was raised in profile in businesses, but it needs to be a core element of business. When anybody talks about going into a new sector in their business or starting a new division or opening a new office, the first people that they should talk to is the security people, or they should certainly be at the table and explaining what needs to happen to make sure whatever it is the business is doing remains secure.
And also, I feel these technologies, they move and improve so fast that to try to get the regulation to keep up is just impossible, right?
Yeah, keeping up with regulation is complex. If you look at even the privacy regulations around the world, I'm more knowledgeable maybe about some of the US ones and European ones, but some of them are about where the transaction takes place. So some of them are about your own citizens, regardless of where in the world they are and are transacting. Once you get differences in regulations and who they comply to, now if you're a company sitting in South Africa, do I need to comply with? Well, obviously need to comply with the one in South Africa, but do I then need to comply with this one in California? Do I need to comply with GDPR? There's so many different questions that start then coming up. Which ones I need to comply with? I think to a certain degree, you've got to comply with obviously the one in your own territory. But then I think you need to take an approach that actually I need to take the core concepts of all of them and comply with all of them. And the reason being is because actually they may well still apply even though you're not in that jurisdiction. Because for example, if a California resident is transacting with a company in South Africa, actually the law in California applies, even if that California resident is currently traveling in Europe or traveling in Africa. And I'm just saying it's a very complex scenario. The importance is, my best recommendation to any company is follow a cybersecurity framework, because it's very defendable. If you've got documented process and you've followed a documented process that's recommended by an organization that's regarded well, so for example, NIST in the US, follow their cybersecurity framework, and it will be very defendable to a regulator if you do fall foul of it.
As we close off our conversation, I want to get your point of view on the role of partnerships in trying to ensure that we fight these, incidents and bad actors, right? Cybersecurity incidents can affect a listed company, a small business, a government, etc. How do we ensure that we have a framework that's going to address all these incidents?
Well, I think this is about how companies deliver services. So if I'm a big enterprise and I've got 50,000 employees and several million customers, I've likely got my own teams. I've probably got a big cybersecurity team. I've probably got my own database teams and privacy teams, etc. And if I'm a small business with 100 people down at the other end, I don't have those teams and I don't have that resource. And this is where the enterprise might build something and might do it themselves. The company down the other end needs to rely on external providers. So they need to ensure that the external providers they use, both in security and in the applications they use, are compliant in those ways. And they need to ensure that they're using those services in a compliant way. If you're using a piece of software to do your customer management, have you turned on the multi-factor authentication for your employees to access it? Hopefully you have. If you didn't, then you've probably fallen foul actually of a cybersecurity framework recommendation or a regulatory requirement. So you've got to make sure that, my point here is, don't try and do everything yourself. Use providers that already do this for you and understand the regulations. Yeah, but make sure that then you use their services in a compliant fashion.
If there's one tip you can give to, to someone who has a cybersecurity concern right now, what would it be?
Well, the one tip would actually be, don't think it's not going to be you. Take it seriously. It's a business risk. The other thing that I think I want to just mention is why in that threat report, there were a couple of examples of up and coming threats. Some of these threats get really sophisticated really quickly or become very social engineering. There was a threat in the report detailed, and I'd recommend people go read it, about NFC attacks. So you have your phone, it's got an NFC reader on it, and it was a social engineering scam where somebody will get you to install an app and then ask you to hold your bank card next to the app. And of course, what they do is they then relay it to somewhere else. So my point is, stay abreast of some of the up-and-coming attacks. Make sure you read things like threat reports, or even just skim them and glance at them. Understand, the types of attacks, what's trending, and etc. It might not be super interesting, but even just having an awareness means that when something gets discussed in your business, you'll go, oh yeah, I seem to remember something about that. We need to research that and make sure that we do it in a secure fashion. Staying abreast of things helps you secure the future. But if for a small business, for me, it's all about managed services.
You should also urge people to listen to podcasts like these, where you outline all these problems and solutions, right?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. Well, in fact, your podcast is a great example. I just said, isn't it, that stay aware of the things that a base awareness, and podcasts like this are exactly that. You can play this in the car on the way to work. We're far more entertaining than Robbie Williams or Coldplay. And you can listen to us, and we'll keep you informed.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Tony. I think this is, an important conversation, because it's not a conversation that's had a lot, because people don't think of cybersecurity as a sexy thing to talk about, to know about, right? So it's been a pleasure getting to know your thoughts and your recommendations and your solutions. And I urge all the listeners to check out the report to really get, a clear idea on the state of cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we did a webinar on the threat report. You could go and certainly catch that webinar. I think at the end of that webinar, we gave 5 top things to think about as well. So make sure you understand what it is you're trying to protect. Make sure that you've got a good backup, your patching, vulnerability management. Make sure you've got good endpoint detection and response. Make sure you have a cyber resilience plan. So you know what to do if something was to happen. And by the way, don't store the cyber resilience plan electronically. Have it in a folder on the desk. Because if somebody comes and takes down your digital infrastructure, you need to be able to go and look at the cyber resilience plan. So we'll leave people with that one, I think.
Again, I really, really appreciate your time, Tony. Cheers. Have a great day.